All right, so everybody, thanks so much for listening. If you are listening to our podcast for the first time, please subscribe to this podcast. We interview amazing people that do amazing things around the country and around the world. We have a special guest on today. This is Jason Hill, and some people may know about him by his new book out, What Do White Americans Owe Black People? Definitely check it out. All right, so Jason, talk to the viewers a little bit about you in general.
Well, I am a professor at DePaul University, where I've been there for I've been a professor for 25 years, but I've been at DePaul for 22. I was born and raised in Jamaica and came to America when I was about 20 years old, and left Jamaica because I had a very nice childhood, but the island is so small that I just felt claustrophobic, and my brother and I decided we wanted to leave, and our mom thought we were too young, so she came along and dragged our grandmother along with her, and went to Atlanta and did my undergraduate in philosophy and literature as a double major, and worked a lot of hours, worked 45 hours to put myself through school, and graduated magna cum laude, and then got a scholarship to do my Ph.D. at Purdue University in philosophy, where I specialized in ethics and political philosophy, and did some work in psychology also. Got a certification in developmental psychology, and then wrote a couple of books in political philosophy and ethics, and then ventured into the commercial world of publishing with my last two books. We Have Overcome: An Immigrant's Letter to the American People, and then this new one that you just mentioned, What Do White Americans Owe Black People? What Do White Americans Owe Black People? Racial Justice in the Age of Post-Oppression. And I also write for a lot of magazines. I'm a columnist for Front Page magazine. I write a bi-monthly column, and I also write for the Federalist and for The Hill, and occasionally for Commentary magazine, American Greatness. So I'm pretty busy. I'm teaching a full load of courses and being a public intellectual, and just a great American patriot, and love this country passionately, and trying to fight for its exceptionalism, to tell people why America, I think, is the greatest country on the face of the earth. And in an age where I think there's a lot of Americophobia floating around, and people are talking about America's in a decline, which I think it is, unfortunately. And just trying to do my part to sort of fight the idea pathogens that are out there infecting this country, and trying to fight the individuals who are trying to take down America, which is not an easy job.
I want to go into this again for people that are listening. This is Jason Hill. He's going to be speaking about his new book out in just a second. It's What Do White Americans Owe Black People? Can you talk about the book in general, and what made you want to write this book, Jason?
Well, I wanted to write this book because it's a sort of follow-up book from my previous book, my fourth book, What We Have Overcome: An Immigrant's Letter to the American People, which was really a love letter to the American people, a book of gratitude, explaining to them, thanking them for permitting me to be an immigrant, because I think immigration is not a right; it's a privilege, and for making something of my life and fighting the Americophobia. But there is a particular manifestation of Americophobia that I saw inundating our culture, which was the reparations argument, the critical race theory argument, the whole, what I call the woke supremacists, right, and cancel culture wrapped up all in one. And I think reparations feed the reparations argument, or the reparations policies that are pushing through California, pushing through Congress, which is a highly divisive idea. I wanted to address this head on. I wanted to show that I wanted to take the reparations argument really seriously, but I wanted to show that the foundations on which it rests, I should say, are specious, they're false. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to go back to the beginning of the beginning to show that the foundations of Black freedom are actually in the 1776 and in the Declaration of Independence, and in our second founding, in those Lincoln's Gettysburg Address and the Civil War, and more importantly, in the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which I call a great third founding of this country. It was also a moral eugenics program that sought to re-socialize the sensibilities of white people and to make them non-racist. It was a violation of property rights. I think an appropriate violation of property rights, given the collusion of the state in making racists out of white people. It was forcing them to recontextualize property rights. And through the 1972 Employment Act and the civil rights programs, I argue that reparations have already been made towards Black Americans in various forms through Black Studies programs, and that it's a highly divisive policy that would really rip this country apart. And that furthermore, the various other arguments on which it's predicated, that is ancestral guilt, is false. Most white people living today, their ancestors did not own slaves. Their ancestors came after the civil rights movement. And even if their ancestor did own slaves, that has nothing to do with them. There are no white people today who own slaves, and there are no Black people living in America who are slaves. So I basically wanted to show that the reparations argument rests on something much more deeper, that is this culture of entitlement, right? Which is, I think, sweeping America in a larger sense, which is a very, very un-American phenomenon. And that the reparations movement is parasitic on this culture, this cult of entitlement and victimology. And I wanted to address that in the book, which I do quite thoroughly.
How can we get away from this cultish behavior that we all have to agree with everybody? You know, we got to be on our tippy toes when we say something to other people. Let's just act natural. Let's just talk natural to each other. And just, we're all in this together. Why do we have to, say that something that happened 50, 80, 100 years ago, I'm against these things. But like you said, I didn't do it. My parents didn't do it. My grandparents didn't do it. And if somebody did it, they're way down the line. I didn't even know these people. I would stand against these people. So how do we kind of bring that to the liberal friends that we have, or even the center left friends we have?
Well, I think there are two things. One is to show that the ethical standards that we use to appraise actions today, it's very problematic to apply those ethical standards 50, 60 years ago, because this, for various reasons, that the norms and mores that people use to judge their actions, which are completely alien to us today, are actions that would seem quite normal, and the norms and mores that we use to judge our actions are going to seem barbaric and savage to generations 50 years or 60 years from now. I mean, many of my students already think that eating animals is a form of murder. So using the norms and standards today that we use to appraise actions and apply them retroactively, or armchair quarterbacking, apply them retroactively is quite something quite problematic. But also to divest people of their damn self-righteousness. That is to point to people who are scapegoating and accusing people of all these transgressions, to show that they themselves are guilty, that they're not without sin, right? And that they are just, in some sense, projecting their own shadow selves onto people. That is, if you look within their own dark history, they themselves are guilty of many, many transgressions, which they can't bring themselves to admit. So it's a form of what I call moral cleansing, right? And I think also to divest people of the idea that there's something called ethical comedy. Comedy artists, there's no such thing as ethical art, or they're ethical people, but art is not an ethical enterprise. Art is there to tell the truth. And sometimes you tell the truth by saying things that are mean-spirited, that are funny. And sometimes the only way to get at the truth is by going beneath the niceties and the pleasantries and the protocols and the decorous mores and norms that we have established for civil behavior. Yes, we should be nice to each other in the street and practice good manners. But when we get into a comedy club, we allow the comedian to get beneath all these mores and norms that are fictitious, that our fictitious lies that we tell ourselves, first of all. So, we comport ourselves in a certain manner to get through life, which is proper. But when we get into comedy, when we get into art, the whole purpose of art is to divest ourselves of these shibboleths, of these fictions that we practice in our day-to-day living to strategically get through life. And sometimes you have to say nasty things in comedy. Sometimes you have to say mean-spirited things in comedy to get to the truth. And we don't eviscerate people of their dignity on the street. But if you don't like to hear things that are being said, then don't go to those settings, right? But I think the moral self-righteousness is something that we've got to just strip people of and tell people that, inform people that they themselves are guilty of transgressions, that they're not innocent, and that they're not owning their own shadow, and that they're just scapegoating, and to stop being apologetic. Comedians and artists and people who have committed transgressions in the past simply have to just move forward with their lives, stop apologizing, stop second guessing everything that they're going to say, and realize that we're fallible creatures who will make mistakes, and inevitably so. And if we harm someone unintentionally, we apologize, we move on. We don't deserve to lose our careers. We don't deserve to have our lives completely ruined. I'll tell you a joke. There was a guy, an English guy, who was my best friend in college. He was a very aristocratic English guy. I dressed him up in blackface in college, and I put on artificial Rastafarian dreadlocks, and I taught him some of the Jamaican patois, the lingo, like yaman and come on man, and the Caribbean students and I paraded him through this party, and the Caribbean students got a kick out of it. The African American students were like appalled, and we're like, it's funny. It's because he's so aristocratic and he's so poo poo poo, and we had him in blackface, and we thought it was funny. And I didn't see anything wrong with it, because he was representing a white guy. We dressed up as a Jamaican Rastafarian. It was funny as hell to hear him try to speak the Jamaican local dialect, and it was all in good faith, and it was all in good spirit, and everybody, all the Caribbean students had a good laugh, and he had a good laugh. If he did something like that today, I would be canceled. He would be canceled, But so we've become a sort of humorless set of people today, where we don't see humor. Everything is seen through the lens of activism, and everything is seen through the lens of hurting people's feelings, and it's a kind of fragility that we see ourselves as being so fragile. I tell my students, you have a democratic right to be heard and to have your feelings heard. Nobody has a right to eviscerate you of your dignity, but there's a line where if you cross a certain line and people feel like their feelings are hurt, then that gives them the right to cancel you and ruin your career, right? And we've just got to get beyond that. We've got to toughen up a little bit more.
But when did this start, though, Jason? All this wokeness, cancel culture.
I think, Rob, the seeds of it were planted in the 1980s with the self-esteem movement, where every sophomoric opinion that came out of the mouth of a child, every high school opinion that came out of the mouth of a child was raised to the level of human knowledge. And instead of saying, no, that's just a sophomoric high school opinion, or there's just a sophomoric viewpoint, shut up, you're wrong. We raised that to the level of human knowledge. We equated every opinion of a child to the qualitative level of an expert. And so by the time these kids get to my classroom and I tell them, you're wrong, their feelings are hurt, because they were told from K through 12 that every utterance that came out of their mouths was like the equivalent of something that would come out of Einstein's mouth, right? So rather than tell them, you're just wrong, we changed the vocabulary. Teachers, college professors and teachers were no longer teachers or experts. They were like facilitators of knowledge. They were co-participants in this knowledge enterprise. The kids had as much to teach the teacher as much as the teacher had. No, I have a PhD in philosophy. I've been teaching text for 25 years. I've read text 50 times. I can learn certain things from my students, but I can't. There's nothing about the text that they can actually teach me. I mean, if I'm teaching a particular text, right? I can learn something in terms of their interpretation or how they feel about the text, but in terms of the actual objective knowledge that I'm disseminating, right? So we got into radical subjectivism, and then that led to a sort of prioritization of feelings, where we sort of worship, the cult of feelings took primacy because of the self-esteem movement. And so because feelings took ascendancy over reason and logic, and we kind of just took feelings to the level of a cult, it has sort of run amok, and people now feel like if their feelings are hurt, that gives them license to ruin and destroy other people's lives.
I think this really starts a lot in the colleges too, by these professors that really push these agendas on these kids. And they're, and I hear this, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but a lot of these, men and women that are in college, their brains have not fully developed. I think for men, it's like 26 or even closer to 30, and women is a little bit earlier, but they don't think for themselves. They just regurgitate the talking points that the professor says or that these politicians think. So do you think that's where a lot of this problem starts, is in these schools?
Absolutely. I'm an independent conservative, and I've gone on record of calling for the defunding of the universities, because I think they're bastions of, they're not learning institutions anymore. They're bastions of indoctrination centers where these far left, kooky, left-wing Marxist professors who hate America, hate capitalism, hate individualism, hate self-reliance, are brainwashing. I mean, I've seen this at my university. I've seen it at other universities where they brainwash the students. If you hold a conservative viewpoint, even mildly conservative viewpoint, you get demonized, you get shut down. I've been in particular workshops at other institutions where, just as a visitor, where I've been told if a white guy puts his hand up, don't call on him, call on the people of color, or call on the women, or call on the trans students, or call on the LGBTQI plus students. And it's growing exponentially now, right? You don't find conservative professors in the humanities at all, right? You find most of these left-wing professors who have an agenda, who politicize the classroom, who shut down free speech. And when I teach a course, students do not know my political orientation unless they Google me and they find out that I've written an article in the Federalist or something like that. I teach in a very dispassionate. When I teach Plato, they think, oh, he's in love with Plato. I prefer Aristotle. When I teach Marx, they think I'm a Marxist. I'm most certainly not a Marxist. I teach, John Stuart Mill, whom I adore, but I teach him with the same kind of dispassionate, objective way that I would teach, let's say, Ayn Rand or Hayek or a libertarian thinker, as I would teach a socialist, a Fabian socialist. And this is not the case with most professors who have an agenda to turn these students into left-wing kooks. And radical, really, they have an agenda to radicalize the students into becoming radical leftists and not to be critical, sovereign, autonomous thinkers. And that's why I talk about the idea of pathogens that are suffusing our culture. They're coming out of these incubating centers that are our universities. Our universities have become cults. They really have become cults. And it's changed. I mean, it wasn't when I'm 56, and when I was in college in the late 80s, I graduated in 92, I graduated pretty late at 26. Things were a little bit better. I mean, the kooks were still there, but there was still some semblance of balance and reason, but it's gotten progressively worse. And I worry about the Z generation, because they are caught up in a vortex of activism and advocacy, which supersedes the learning and scholarship. And I care very deeply about them, because I don't want to, you can't write anybody out of history, especially young people. And I'm not going to give up on them, because like you said, their minds are not fully formed. But they really come in there thinking that they know all the answers, and their professors reinforce this notion that their feelings and that their political activisms and their political commitments supersede any kind of objective knowledge, because, you know, we're taught that dead white European racists are the purveyors of Western civilization, and that they should disregard all these texts. So we have this notion of, you know, decolonizing our courses, getting rid of these dead white European males from our texts and replacing them with indigenous writers, and I have no problem including such writers on my text, but the fact is that when we include members of the canon, we include Aristotle and Locke and the founding fathers, because they changed the field. I mean, they changed the fields of studies that we're pursuing. So you just can't randomly throw in some kind of indigenous writer or Black writer here or thinker when they didn't change fundamentally the field. What qualifies someone to be part of the canon is that they changed the field. They had a profound change on the field of study. So it's gotten really, really crazy. And I've written several articles, and in my book, I called for the federal government to completely just defund, and alumni donors to defund the humanities, or to fix, if you're going to fund it, there must be conditionals. There must be equal opportunity for conservative voices to be heard alongside left-wing, because there's nothing wrong with teaching a left-wing viewpoint, right?
Sure.
I mean, it's part of the history of thought, but you have to teach the other side as well.
How can we fix this downfall of America? Because again, if you think, anything conservatively, you're called a racist, a misogynist, an anti-Semite. The list goes on. And it's just either you're with the program and the left-wing ideology, or you're considered a racist, right-wing. It doesn't matter if you're Black, white, Hispanic, Asian, Native American. If you're with the right, you're a racist. So how do we fix this problem in America? Because it just seems with these younger kids, identifying with this liberal ideology, it's going to get worse and worse. And then, we're not going to be the greatest country in the world anymore. We're just going to be like, England.
Well, one is, I was talking to someone in an interview yesterday, and I said, I'm not a Republican, I'm an independent conservative, which means I could vote either way, depending on the candidate. But I said, the Democrats have a coercive monopoly on the votes of most Blacks, because they have sold an ideology that, their well-being, they have their back, and they have their well-being. And we have got to get certain Republican candidates or centrist Democrats to sell to Blacks the idea that radical school reform is in their interest, whether that means not taxing them on the income that they would use to send their child to a charter school or to a private school. I think the teachers union either has to be busted up or to be radically reformed, get rid of the teachers union or radically reform it. School choice, or pay teachers a lot more money and enforce discipline in the school system. A zero-sum tolerance level has to be enforced, where if students act up, they are expelled, and they have to be put out, and it's because there's too much disruption that's going on in the classroom. But the other important thing too is that we have this ideology or this mindset that everything is causally reduced to racism, that disparities between the races is causally reduced to racism, that disciplinary problems are causally reduced by racism. We've got to identify certain problems, that there are pathologies within the Black community, there are pathologies within certain communities, like within the Hispanic community also. 74% of African-American kids are born out of wedlock. And of that 74%, I think about 70% are born into dire poverty. These are systemic problems within the Black community that have to be addressed. This is not the problem created by white people. It's not white men who are going into these communities impregnating Black women. I'm sorry to tell people. right? Blacks constitute 13% of the population, and something like 70% of the crimes that are committed by Blacks. So the carjackings, the rapes, the murders are disproportionately committed by Blacks. The Black on Black crime rate is astronomically horrific. It's so high that I lose track of the statistics because you can't keep track of them. These are systemic pathologies that exist within the Black community, and to sort of blame this on kind of racism is ridiculous. And that's why every chance I get, I sort of, name these pathologies that have to be outed. There are systemic problems within these communities. And it started when, in the latter part of the 60s civil rights movement, when the government took itself to be the surrogate husband of these Black women and disincentivized Black fathers from taking care of their children by being the surrogate parent of these women. So there's got to be a movement within these Black communities to take responsibility, to take accountability for these pathological problems, because the public schools, I might say, disproportionately, the behaviors that are exhibited, the malfeasance and the miscreants, let's just call them what they are. They're miscreants that are wreaking havoc in the schools, the gangs that are infiltrating these schools. These are not predominantly white kids. These are predominantly kids of color. And they're coming from single parent homes with one parent, one mother, predominantly. So nobody wants to talk about these things. This is like the dirty secret that's pushed under the rug. And if you bring this up as a white person, you're called a racist. If you bring this up as a Black person, you're called like the blackface of white supremacy. So we have to have like an open conversation about these systemic problems and these pathologies, and talk about ways in which these have got to be redressed. But in terms of policies, I mean, I would like to see something like policies that empower Black individuals to send their children to charter schools, because Black parents are in the state of New York, in New York City. I mean, I was talking to a friend who's a superintendent in New York, and she said it breaks her heart every year to see the number of Black parents who are on the waiting list to send their kids to private schools, to parochial schools, and to charter schools. And when their children don't get in, they sob, and they want to pull their children from these horrific public schools. Our public schools are disastrous, right? And I have no hope for these democratic run cities in which the majority of these public schools that are, and it's funny that in some of the red states, ironically, the public schools fare better. Like in my state, Chicago, my city, Chicago, which is a democratic run city, the public schools are horrific. They're horrible. So we've got to change the language. We've got to start naming some of these pathologies that are causing, underlying pathologies that are causing the problems. We've got to break up the gangs. I wrote a letter to President Trump, and although I'm not a big fan of President Trump, I like some of his policies. But I did write a letter to him that went viral a couple of years ago, asking him to send in the troops to break up the gangs, because there are ways in which gang infiltration into the public school system is causing many, many problems. And it goes back to, even I work with an organization in Washington where we try to get gang members off the streets by getting small businesses, primarily small businesses, to mentor former gang members. But if you have tax policies that are so astronomically high, you're disincentivizing small businesses from making outreach programs to former gang members or to inner city youths. So, a message has to be communicated to Blacks to support policies, whether they're coming from Republicans or centrist Democrats, not these far left kooks, to support policies that are in their economic self-interest. But neither party has systematically presented a conversation that is coherent to the Black community or to the Hispanic community, in which they can understand policies that are in their rational self-interest, because those policies actually don't exist, because both parties really operate from a principle of expediency and not from some sort of, really coherent, consistent, principled, sustained strategy. So one of the things that before we go, that I'm going to start doing is sort of creating a conversation about, what it means to be a traitor to the values of your country, when you can sell out to something like a horrific country like China. China's a horrible country. And without demonizing individuals, but just talk about, what it means to literally sell your soul for the sake of economic expediency to a foreign country, to the detriment of your own country. And to have I wouldn't dare introduce those conversations because they're too political in my classroom, but as a public intellectual,
right,
to sort of have those conversations and to write books and to have podcasts about those, to retrain. I mean, we could have them in the classroom in a non-political way, in a non-sort of didactic, open-ended way.
Mm-hmm.
But I think those conversations need to be had so that Americans really sort of, again, feel this pride. I don't know how to, I feel very paralyzed by this kind of Americophobia, this sense where people are letting their country down, this great, amazing country, for the sake of economic expediency. It's very disappointing.
So let's end with this last question. What do you hope millennials that watch this, Jason, get out of this interview?
I want them to not give up on America. I think a lot of people have already decided, that unconsciously they've decided America is no longer in this triumphalist state, that we are declining, and that it's like the China analog. They're just going to grab what they can get. And I've heard a lot of millennials, because I've taught them, say they're just going to grab what they can get, retire as early as possible, and enjoy. And there's nothing wrong with enjoying your life. What I hope they get is a sense that this is a great, magnificent country that is worth fighting for. Use your agency to fight for the virtue of your pride. Fight for the grandeur of this country. Fight for the values that have made this country a great, great country. And use your agency to fight against cancel culture, to fight against woke supremacy. There's too much quietism. There's too much apology. There's too much that by default, your silence by default allows these radical left-wing kooks to win. And if you remain quiet, or if you remain an apologist, and if you just remain concerned with a kind of Me Tooism, and there's nothing wrong with rational self-interest. I'm all for that. But I want to see millennials be galvanized to make America, dare I say the term, a really, really great again. To make it, and also not just to make America great again, to make America noble. I want millennials to leave with the idea of make America noble again. Where when I first came to this country, Rob, America was feared, she was loved, she was respected. When Ronald Reagan said, "Mr. Gorbachev, take those walls down," the walls came down. We're a laughing stock now, and we have a joke as a president who's even making it more of a laughing stock. So I want millennials to do anything that they can in their powers to make this country, to use their creative and their imaginative capabilities to make America noble again.
Jason Hill, again, on Fire Breathing Rob. Jason, where can people get your books, learn more about you, find you on social media?
Well, I think the shelf life of a book is 3 months now. So it used to be in Amazon. It used to be in Barnes and Noble, because I saw them. So they can get it on a really good discount on Amazon for $21. So go to Amazon. If you can find it at Barnes and Noble or your indie bookshop, fine. And you can follow me on Twitter at Jason D. Hill 6, or on Facebook at Dr. Jason D. Hill 1913 on Facebook. And I also have a website, jasondamianhill.com. It's just my full name, Damian, jasondamianhill.com.
All right, Jason Hill, thanks so much for your time today. It was a really eye-opening experience. I hope the listeners really open their eyes a little bit more. We have a lot of liberals that listen in, so hopefully they learned a little bit, and there's no name calling in the comments section when this goes up.
Thanks, Rob. It was my pleasure.